Tonight on KQED Newsroom, the U.S. Supreme Court overturns 50 years of precedent, striking down Roe v. Wade and the right to an abortion. President Joe Biden addressed the nation this morning.
The court literally taking America back 150 years. This is a sad day for the country, in my view. But it doesn't mean the fight's over.
We look at California's response. And gender and sexuality historian Susan Stryker joins us to talk about pride and a recent intrusion by the Proud Boys at a drag queen storytelling hour. Plus, June is Pride Month, and San Francisco's colorful pride decorations are this week's look at something beautiful. Coming to you from KQED headquarters in San Francisco this Friday, June 24th. Hello and welcome to KQED Newsroom. I'm Scott Schaefer, in for Priya David Clemens. Today, the U.S. Supreme Court overturned the 1973 decision protecting women's right to an abortion. We begin with Michele Goodwin. She's a constitutional law professor at UC Irvine and author of Policing the Womb, Invisible Women and the Criminalization of Motherhood. Professor Goodwin, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me back to speak with you.
You know, in many ways, this was not a surprise. We had the leaked version of this a few weeks ago, which you and I talked about back then. But as you read it over, now that it is reality, what really jumps out for you?
Well, what jumps out is not only the symbolism contained within this decision, but substantively what it means. If we were to start with matters of law, this is a rollback not just related to reproductive health, privacy, and liberty, but this is a rollback in terms of the rule of law itself and how we expect the Supreme Court to uphold the Constitution and to be vouchsafed on certain key liberty aspects. But this is also alarming in terms of what it means in terms of health. The United States is the deadliest place in the developed world for a woman to be pregnant and ranks 55th in the world. In Mississippi, the state from which this law that the Supreme Court has allowed to go into effect, and even worse, overturning Roe v. Wade, a Black woman is 118 times more likely to die by carrying a pregnancy to term. And so we have to keep that as part of the conversation, what's a matter of law and also what's a matter of health here.
Well, and you know, for a number of years, the number of abortions has been declining in this country. To what extent will this decision reduce even further the number of abortions, do you think?
That's a really good question because abortions have been performed for millennia. Abortions were being performed by the Pilgrims. And if we look at the lead up to Roe v. Wade, there were people who felt so urgent the desire to not be pregnant that they risked their own lives. And many did die from back alley abortions. And then there were others that found freedom and liberty by going abroad to terminate a pregnancy or going to a state like New York. So while states will restrict abortion rights, there will be people who leave those states trying to get to free states where they can terminate pregnancies, including in California, New York, Illinois, and Colorado, amongst the states.
Absolutely. And of course, the governor today, in fact, signed a bill, AB 1666, which will protect women coming to California or anyone who helps them come here to get an abortion. To what extent can a state like California really insulate women from legal jeopardy and give them the kinds of services that they want and need?
So it does mean that what's taxed in California happens to be the capacities of its institutions that perform reproductive health care. Do we have an adequate supply of doctors and medical providers, nurses who can help in helping people in their reproductive health care needs, whether it's prenatal care or being able to terminate an abortion? And so those are real questions in terms of capacity for the state of California, but certainly the urgency and the need and recognizing the constitutional rights at stake has been something that California has always been committed to. Long before many other states, California had protected the right to privacy in its constitution and as a matter of state law.
And yet, in California, it is still hard to find these services in places like the Central Valley and northern rural California. This decision and California's becoming a kind of haven for women seeking abortion, it would seem would only exacerbate that problem.
Well, it's a really good question that you ask with regard to capacities and people who may still be vulnerable, who, because of marginalized status, based on geographic limitations or socioeconomic constraints, may still suffer. I mean, look, this is a state where even recently there was someone who was charged with first-degree murder in the wake of a stillbirth. So we must be careful and we must be mindful and vigilant, even in a state like California. The state of California is one where women who were incarcerated were coercively sterilized. And fortunately, the legislature eventually addressed those issues. But it is to say that we are still on that long arc towards justice. It's 2022, and women are still fighting for the right to bodily autonomy, despite constitutional precedents, despite the rule of law. And that is what makes this decision so dangerous in 2022, that women are still petitioning for the right of personhood in the United States. And that's not hyperbole, that's the decision itself.
And this decision specifically affected or addressed a law in Mississippi, but there are many states that have so-called trigger laws that will take effect banning abortion in anticipation of this ruling. How is that going to roll out, do you think?
Well, that's great that you asked that question already. There are more than 24 states that have what you name as, and others have, trigger laws. That means when the Supreme Court issues a decision like this places in motion their abortion restrictions in their states. Many of those states will ban abortion outright, and for others, they will dramatically constrain the right to be able to terminate a pregnancy. And in many of these states, they no longer will be providing provisions for cases of rape or incest, which also helps to show the cruelty behind these laws and what the Supreme Court has ultimately upheld. You just can't make up the cruelty that's found in this.
Governor Newsom today said that the majority on the court is just getting wound up. They're just getting started. And in fact, Justice Thomas, in his concurring opinion, talked about, well, we can use this legal theory against things like privacy and contraception and other LGBT rights, same-sex marriage. How concerned should people be about that?
Should be deeply concerned, and we should begin to string together things that we've seen in our country. So Justice Thomas is vying to be the most conservative justice that we've seen on the United States Supreme Court in a century. Clearly, during the time in which Justice Scalia was on the court, there was a kind of vying back and forth. But Justice Thomas, by this concurring opinion, makes very clear that he's not finished yet, and that he wouldn't mind seeing all manner of other privacy protections be eviscerated and go away. And that includes LGBTQ equality, marriage equality, contraceptive access. And he's not alone. There are legislators that are in these anti-abortion states that have also said they want to criminalize access to IUDs and contraception, such as Plan B, which is used as a gold standard after a woman has been raped.
Well, and that's an interesting point, because you could see, for example, states going after doctors or pharmaceutical companies possibly for even shipping these kinds of drugs that induce miscarriage. Is that also a possibility legally?
Well, Scott, I'm glad that you asked that question, because we can really pull back from, learn from the Jim Crow playbook, where there were just absurdist types of laws that were enacted. And despite the fact that they were absolutely absurd, they certainly did hurt the dignity and the rights of the people who were affected. Laws such as Black people can't play checkers in the park, laws that criminalize Black people being in taxis with white people, all those kinds of things which seem strange and absurd, but we should learn from that. And that is to say, absurdist laws we will see next. Laws that 20 or 30 years from now, when we have a new Reconstruction, people will look back and say, how in the world could those laws have been enacted? Well, that is where we are today. Think about this, with this Supreme Court decision, a girl who was 10 years old, who has been raped by her stepfather, brother, or uncle, will be forced to carry a pregnancy to term that she doesn't want and become a mother at 11 years old. That's what the Supreme Court has sanctioned.
It is a new day and a really disturbing one for many, many people. Professor Goodwin, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Scott.
I'm joined next by two KQED reporters who have been covering the impact of today's Supreme Court decision and other issues. Joining me now, our KQED politics and government correspondent, Marisa Lagos, and KQED science reporter, Danielle Venton. Thanks to both of you for being here.
Scott, thanks for having us.
Danielle, let me begin with you. I know you've been talking with some advocates for reproductive rights here in the Bay Area about the decision today. What are you hearing?
There's a lot of outrage and disappointment. This was expected, and so they have been preparing for weeks and even months for today's decision. They're calling for action from people who are upset by this decision through volunteering, protests, advocating for policy, and calls for volunteers even.
When you say volunteers and action, like what are you thinking? I mean, there's going to be spontaneous protests, I would think, today and this weekend, but what more?
I've spoken with some local groups who help women and people who need abortions pay for them, travel, get to the clinic, even assist with childcare if it's needed.
And Marisa, I know that Democrats in particular are hoping that this will activate voters in the fall, some of those issues that Danielle just alluded to. What are your thoughts about how, especially these competitive congressional races, might be affected?
Yeah, to your point, there's some 5 to 7 races that could help decide the balance of Congress. And I think Democrats are looking at this with both a mix of fear and outrage and sadness, but also some hope that it will activate folks. We heard Speaker Pelosi say this today, that your rights are on the ballot this November. I think that will be at issue, certainly in some of those congressional races, in other legislative races as well. And I think in particular there's an opening here for younger Democrats or even no party preference voters here in California who may be pretty disappointed. I mean, we've seen dismal approval ratings for Joe Biden and the Democratic Party. This may be one of those issues that does activate folks and proves a counterpoint perhaps to inflation concerns and other things that Democrats know that they're going to have to be fighting against. You need something to fight for, and I think that this could be it.
Well, and another thing that would speak to that would be this constitutional amendment that Democrats are hoping to put on the ballot for November to enshrine abortion rights in the California Constitution. What impact would that have, practically speaking, but also politically?
Yeah, I mean, politically, again, it could help get people to the polls. It might be that activating issue for folks who see themselves as maybe even one-issue voters. I think, more broadly, the hope is that this protects against future potential changes in California. I was on a call with the Senate President Pro Tem, Toni Atkins. She's like, we're not worried about this legislature, but as we've seen, courts change quickly. We don't know sort of the fallout from this among other rights. So I think that there's a hope that both that serves in the short term as a way to get people to the polls and in the long term as a real concrete way to protect constitutional rights.
And Danielle, beyond the politics, there are some real life implications of all this for women, not just in California, but of course across the country. But you've done some talking, I know, and reporting with UCSF researchers looking at how being denied an abortion affects women. What are you hearing from them?
Women who cannot access an abortion when they want it are more likely to enter poverty. And interestingly, women, even when followed years after their abortion, 95% of them say it was the right decision for them. And they may go on to have children and to be very happy parents.
Yeah.
I mean, we should add, most women who have abortions already have kids. And I think that we need to talk about the fact that pregnancy is more dangerous than abortion, and that is really what we see in those numbers.
And they have children when they want to. I think that's sort of the point. We have done some reporting at KQED and elsewhere about access to abortion is not always so easy in parts of California, and yet now we're talking about making it easier for women in other states to come here to get those sorts of services. Marisa, what is the legislature thinking about when it comes to shoring up the infrastructure for these kinds of services now for women who are already here, much less the ones who will be coming?
Well, they're trying to walk and chew gum at the same time, so to speak, right? We have 15 bills pending, including that amendment. And when we talked this week on Political Breakdown with one of the assembly leaders who's doing that, Rebecca Bauer-Kayan from the East Bay, she really talked about the idea that expanding access to not just abortion, but reproductive care, especially in rural areas of California, is key to all of this, right? California can't welcome a 3,000 increase in women from other states and people who need abortions if they don't have the ability to serve the folks that are already here. And so I think that there's a real effort in the state legislature to put money, resources behind both clinics like Planned Parenthood, but also places like UCSF that provide reproductive care as well.
Another big decision this week from the Supreme Court having to do with guns, striking down a law in New York State which limited the licensing of guns. What impact might that decision have here in California.
Yeah, kind of split screen there, right? On one hand, states can't ban abortion, but they can. They also can't say that you can't have these types of concealed carry permits.
Well, and the U.S. Senate passing a gun control bill as the Supreme Court is striking down or
and
limiting.
The House as well. Yeah, so that is going to the president. I mean, I think that what we're going to see in California, it does invalidate our concealed carry permit structure. It also has wider implications. What the court was really saying is that you can't kind of make somebody jump through an extra hoop to exercise what they consider a core constitutional right, that is to bear arms. And so I think California and other states who have these types of books, laws on the books that essentially say you don't just get to carry a weapon outside of your house because it's the Second Amendment, you need a special threat against you. They're going to try to rewrite those in ways that at least allow the prohibition of guns, say, in sensitive areas like schools, government buildings, airports. So definitely a lot, I think, right now of kind of conversations behind closed doors about how to tweak those laws so that they're not completely invalidated.
Yeah, but of course they will be probably challenged by gun rights folks.
Absolutely.
Transitioning to climate change and weather, we've seen some weird weather, lightning strikes here in the Bay Area. What's happening, Danielle, and how is this related to climate change?
Well, we know lightning strikes aren't unheard of in the Bay Area, but they are unlikely. Emerging research is also showing that climate change makes those dry lightning strikes more likely. They are a huge source of wildfires, and so we can expect that to be more common in the future.
And what is CAL FIRE? I know you've done some investigation with Capitol Public Radio looking at CAL FIRE and some of their practices around prevention. What did you find there?
We looked at how CAL FIRE was responding to its non-firefighting responsibilities focusing on forest management and preventative activities. There's been a huge investment from the legislature in recent years for that side of its job, $1.5 billion to be spent over 2 years. And we found that it was fumbling a number of key responsibilities. Some of those are in the areas of responding to laws quickly, managing data well, even things like getting legally mandated reports out on time. There's some that are 4 years late. And a culture of resistance to change, to this more prevention-focused mindset instead of just suppression all the time.
Wow, which is so critically important now to prevent them because we're having a hard time fighting them.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of money in the budget for a lot of these things, but it's if you don't have an agency implementing it, you have a problem.
Absolutely, and I think it's always better to stop a fire before it starts, then we don't have to spend those billions of dollars and of course risk lives, property, and the environment.
Yeah, part of all this of course is water, and we're in the middle of a historic drought. Interesting how Jerry Brown and Gavin Newsom seem to be handling this issue of conservation differently. Any thoughts, observations about that?
Yeah, we really saw our former governor, Jerry Brown, institute sort of a top-down approach. He spoke about water conservation all the time. We really saw Californians respond. Gavin Newsom's approach has been much more bottom-up. He is leaving it to local water districts to encourage conservation. We have seen
which hasn't been terribly
effective,
right?
far fewer conservation steps.
Do you think, Marisa, that may have something to do if we've had 2.5 years now of top-down orders around the pandemic? Maybe he just feels like people have had it with that from government?
I mean, whatever you think of Gavin Newsom, let's give him a little grace. It's been a tough few years to lead this state, to be any leader. And I do think that at a time when you're telling people, you know, they're just coming back to school, that they still need to wear masks. No, they don't. Yes, they do. All these things that I think the governor was a little reticent to make other demands, ones that are very impactful to people's day-to-day lives. But at the end of the day, he's going to have to, I think.
Yeah, almost out of time, but we have two moms here, and vaccines are available for the littlest kids against COVID. Thoughts about how big a game changer that is?
It seemed like really good news to me. I have a little boy who's just over 1. Yeah, there's 2 vaccines available now, Pfizer and Moderna. You can get those from your healthcare provider if they have them, pharmacies. You can also sign up on the state website, My Turn.
Yeah,
it's a huge relief. My kids are already boosted because they're old enough, so good news for parents. I know that's been a long time coming.
Yeah, of course, many parents have chosen, at this point anyway, not to get the shots. We'll see if that changes in the weeks and months ahead. All right, Danielle Venton, Marisa Lagos, thank you both very much.
Thanks,
Pleasure.
Scott.
This weekend, hundreds of thousands of people across the Bay Area will be celebrating Pride with parties, parades, and festivals. The tradition dates back more than 50 years to the Stonewall riots in New York City, where police raided a gay bar and the community fought back, launching the modern gay rights movement. Pride is now celebrated around the world each year. And in San Francisco, the festivities will be in person after years of being interrupted by the pandemic. Joining me to talk about all things Pride is historian Susan Stryker, co-author of the book Gay by the Bay. Susan Stryker, welcome and thanks for coming in.
Thanks for having me, Scott.
Let's begin by having you react, if you would, to the SCOTUS decision, the Supreme Court decision today, striking down 50 years of precedent with Roe v. Wade.
Yeah, I noticed you just said celebrate Pride in your opening remarks, and I think it's really important to say that besides celebrating, we actually need to be protesting. You know, that Pride started as a riot. It started as a protest. It became a march. It's more than a party. And I think in the contemporary United States today, it's like there's an awful lot that we need to be protesting. I think we need to be protesting what the Supreme Court just did and taking away rights that have been granted to more than half the population. And the thing that links it to the celebration of Pride and to the struggle for queer liberation is that ultimately it really is a question of bodily autonomy, of being able to make informed decisions about your own lives, whether that's how you're making a family, having a partner, having your erotic life, and it's like it is directly related to.
Yeah, and Clarence Thomas, in his a concurring opinion today, said, "Oh, we can use the same rationale to look at contraception rights and LGBT rights." So obviously, this
rolling
is not
back
the
Griswold, rolling back, Lawrence v. Texas, rolling back Obergefell. We're in a very dire moment in our national history.
Yeah, so kind of mixed feelings for this weekend of celebration, as you note. San Francisco, of course, has been at the forefront of so many of the rights that have been won by the queer community. What are your thoughts about where we are today? There was also a controversy about LGBTQ cops marching in uniform in the parade. So a lot of mixed feelings, I think, around these issues.
Yeah, I personally feel that that many of the abuses against transgender people and queer people have taken place at the hands of the police force. It's like the police have often not been friends to the community, and I totally support the idea of police not marching in uniform in the parade. Some of my own historical work is actually about the Compton's cafeteria riot here in San Francisco, which took place in 1966, 3 years before Stonewall, and that was a riot by queer and trans people against systemic police violence. So
at the same time, you have LGBT people, trans people in the SFPD who fought to be there and fought for the right to march in uniforms. Would it be, in their view, they see it as going backwards if you tell them they can't march in uniform?
We're going to have to agree to disagree on that one. It's like I totally support individuals. My next door neighbor is a police officer. He's a really great guy. Nothing against any individual, but as a force, the police force is used more often than not against queer and trans liberation.
Speaking of police, in Idaho, a couple of weeks ago, the police arrested a group of right-wing extremists who appeared to be on their way to a Pride celebration to disrupt it. We saw here in the Bay Area, State Senator Scott Wiener receiving a bomb threat at his home. Also over in the East Bay, Drag Queen Storytelling Hour was disrupted, apparently by some members of Proud Boys. What do you see as the through line for all these things?
I see the through line here being that we're in a moment of profound political reaction in this country where a lot of extrajudicial forms of violence against queer and trans people is manifesting, vigilante violence. I honestly don't think that the state is going to save us. I think it is really time for us to be mobilizing for our own self-defense as
What
queer and
does
trans
that
people.
look like? Let's be specific.
Well,
let's say that the
I mean, let's
library
just say
situation.
at first, we just need to keep our eyes open in public. We need to make sure that we have people who are kind of keeping an eye on each other, sort of within a community, kind of like a neighborhood watch. Not expecting the police to come in and save us, not feeling like the thing that we first need to do is to call the police to intervene. It's like I think the more people can take care of their own needs without getting the state involved, the better it will be.
Although Scott Wiener, I'm sure, was pleased when the police checked for bombs at his house.
I think he probably was. That's true.
Yeah.
So, but I think it's a deeper question of how can we in our society actually take care of everybody's needs, make sure everybody is treated fairly, everybody gets a fair shake, without the resort to some kind of coercive power.
Yeah. Susan Stryker, thank you so much. Happy Pride. Thank you for coming in.
Sure.
San Francisco has celebrated Gay Pride every year since 1970. Ahead of this Sunday's 52nd annual parade featuring floats, local politicians, and of course, Dykes on Bikes, our look at something beautiful this week, our Pride decorations around the city. And that's our show for tonight. You can find KQED Newsroom online or on Twitter, or email us at knr@kqed.org. You can follow me on Twitter or Instagram at Scott Schaefer. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you right back here next Friday night. Have a great weekend.